Good space time, y'all. In this episode of the Citizen Cosmos podcast, I speak with Boris Mann from Fission Codes, powering up decentralized web applications. We discuss the future of Web3 marketing, the steps needed to get away from Web2, and where we are on our Web3 journey. We also talked about interoperability, DIDs, decentralized storage, and the pros and cons of IPFS.
IPFS is awesome, works everywhere in many ways. Content addressing has won and continues to win in really interesting ways. It's a commons network, it's best effort. People say, that's terrible, what if it goes away? And I say the flip side, literally any piece of content that any human on the planet cares about, they can keep online themselves, effectively for free, effectively forever. I think we're in a really tough spot in this Web2 ad-supported world where a lot of people in the world have been trained that everything on the internet is free. They start needing to think about how they help themselves, their users, their partners, their friends, their countries, their regions do stuff. That's the part that we need to start making 100% the part of Web3. I will advocate and shill for content addressing.
Before we rock it off into our next episode, here are some news from the sponsor of this episode, the Cyber Congress DAO. The foundation has started its delegations policy for validators on the Bostrom blockchain, and the Space Pussy network was launched, with 96% of its supply to be dropped to various Cosmos ecosystem chains. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Citizen Cosmos podcast. I have with me Boris Mann from Fission today on the show. Boris, hi, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Do you want to, first of all, introduce yourself and tell us about what you do exactly?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm the founder and CEO of Fission. What Fission is doing is building a full edge computing stack of identity, data, and compute to equip front-end developers with a stack that lets them build these edge applications all on top of IPFS and content addressing. We've been doing that since 2019. Have a long history of being involved in open source. And so we believe what we're doing is very important to basically empower more user privacy and encryption and make it easier for devs to kind of do the hard things, like implement those right from the beginning when building an application.
Yeah, there is actually a lot of the things we connect to, obviously open source, content addressing, and trying to make developers' life easier. I guess it's not an easy task that you have still there, especially in the Web3 world. How do you find it so far, the task?
Well, I think my co-founder, Brooklyn Zelenka, and I, we did some core work with Ethereum. I helped run some of the early Ethereum Magicians unconferences, helped make the Ethereum Magicians Discourse Forum a place for discussion, and Brooke ended up doing core work on the Ethereum virtual machine. What we found is obviously a lot of these things with smart contracts and blockchains has lots of new things that you have to learn, not just new things to learn, but that are themselves just in the process of being built and evolving, and so new for everyone. So everyone's starting on the ground floor. What we found is that a lot of the time, a lot of the challenges came with the regular Web2 stuff. It's too hard to build a full stack application. As a developer, you have to become a full stack developer to build full applications. So while blockchains and similar systems add a sort of back end as a service, there's still all of these other components. And so what we realized is that perhaps there was a way to use these distributed systems and cryptography and content addressing to make these things easier so that developers wouldn't have to end up running a Ruby on Rails or Python or Node.js server, which sort of defeats the purpose of having a decentralized backend. And I'd say generally, yes, this is a hard task, a big step, a task of doing things differently, but also that it's important that we have these things as components when, in comparison, we look at the three American corporations that run the major hyperclouds and say, maybe we want some computing, some edge computing to be run more broadly than just those three companies.
That is something that is like music to my ears, man. No, seriously, because I have been in this field for a long time, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of projects, developers, of course, they really don't make that distinguish between Web two and Web three stack, and a lot of them assume that by building certain something that they can label it as Web three, and very often, as we have seen, that is not the case, and very often, and it leads to really big problems in the industry, and misleads where people take it. In your personal opinion, do you think that today what we label as Web3 or call Web3, I mean, you mentioned yourself, it's very difficult to create that stack. How far away do you think we are on our journey as Web3 to really become Web3 and not Web3 dependent on Web 2?
So I was around in building software in the transition, open source software, and in the transition from Web 1 to Web 2. And I remember at a certain point, a lot of people really hating on the term Web 2, in part because it had been captured. There was a Web 2 conference in San Francisco that I remember that I think tickets were $2,000. And I was in San Francisco at the time. So I just hung out in the lobby outside of where the paid areas was. So we hung out with some of our friends. I think Web3, unfortunately, I think it's something important for us to address. I ended up choosing to use that term. I believe that edge computing, which is where Fission focuses, is a superset of just blockchain technologies, distributed systems, cryptography, content addressing. These are computer science and programming language primitives. They're not owned by anyone. And it shouldn't be a kind of purity test of, are you Web3 enough? So in some ways, we have to go back and say, well, what do we mean by this? And so how far along are we on our journey? Well, we're currently in the journey where a bunch of grifters and various bad actors have made the term Web3 be a bad term for many people. I don't really know what to do about that other than to showcase good things that are happening. There's sort of a parallel or related movement that we'll call the label DWeb. And I'd say another related term would be Fediverse, originally meaning sort of activity pub standards that's happening with Mastodon as a lot of people migrate to that, but also other P2P systems like Secure Scuttlebutt or Matrix Protocol or libp2p and so on. So lots of words, lots of different directions, Web3, DWeb, Fediverse. So in some ways, I think that we have to go back to first principles and say what we mean by these things. Let's make it so that we have portable identifiers. DIDs is one of the things that Fission focuses on. That's not just blockchain accounts. Let's focus on user privacy. Most blockchain systems are completely transparent. You see every single transaction, and every single action you take can be fully correlated. That's bad. It's really bad. And we just kind of accept it as normal, right? And so we need to work on some of those things. So what Fission is doing is it's focusing on building a stack that is an edge computing stack that can address Web 2, no blockchain, but also Web 3. If you want to add encrypted data, you can include some of the stacks and standards that we built on top of IPFS. If you want to have actions that happen off chain, which we do, that's the entire web is off chain if you think about it. So I think we need to have a more nuanced approach to some of these things. I'd like to see a focus on user-owned data. So many people in the blockchain-centric space are like, I have my account, so I own every single one of those transactions that I made on there. Not wrong, based on cryptographic principles and everything else like that. But it's still kind of far away. And usually the user doesn't cache that stuff locally to them. So things like light clients are going to be interesting to me. But to more correctly answer your question and shut up for a moment rather than just monologuing, I think we've made really good progress. I think right now, when you're interviewing me, we're 10 days, 2 weeks into this amazing flourishing of people looking past Twitter and saying, maybe I do want to join a shared server and move on to social media that is run by small servers powered by Mastodon or Pleroma or other activity pub software. And I think that's a really exciting turning point that I personally haven't seen since the early 2000s.
A lot of things resonate there because I mean I'm making notes as we go as usually do, but and I don't know which way to go because like a lot of the things you mentioned, I'm like, oh, I need to get that. I need to get it. I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try. So first of all, about terms, and I mean I can go further. There is the term metaverse, which is the synonym for the internet, in my opinion, being sold under a crazy sauce of I don't even know what sauce it is, but that is one thing, that is crazy thing. But one thing I did want to like get more into is that you mentioned the whole case with Twitter and Mastodon and decentralized social service thing, social networking. This is interesting because I have partially, as a project, and me personally, we have worked very closely with a project that is working also with content addressing and creating a sort of distributed model of communication. But not talking about that, what I do want to mention is that what I have personally found when I was trying to work with the guys and what we still find in very hard, and this is something I've seen in your blog, is about marketing decentralization, that people were completely unready and just really not wanting to use that because it's simply, it doesn't matter if it's decentralized, they don't care. It doesn't matter if it's nobody owns your data, that you own all the data. People just do not want to simply touch things they don't want to touch. They don't want to go beyond their, and I'm really sorry, apologies to say that to everybody, but like, beyond their responsibility bubble kind of thing. So the question is, how do we proceed on with marketing? I'm going to put a label on it, but how do we proceed on with explaining to everybody that what we are labeling here as Web3, that it's not a bad thing, that yes, there's got to be some responsibility, there's got to be some differences, but in the long term, this is what's going to benefit you. This is what's going to help those companies, those big 3 companies, 5 companies, stop from using you to their own desires as they intend. So the question is, sorry, long-term resume, how do we go on about marketing? And this is something I've seen in your blog that I would love to hear more from your opinion here.
Sure. First of all, walk the talk. How many Web3 companies publish to Medium without even bothering to map their own domain to it? You can't even be bothered to do it yourselves. So I think that's a start, is walk the talk in those sorts of ways. From my long involvement with open source, one of the phrases that I like to say is when I got started in open source in the early 2000s, it was still a radical act. It isn't anymore today. And it leads to a lot of people, a lot of developers, not really engaging with it in a certain way. Some of this is just simply, how do we work together? How do we pool effort? There are a lot of financial incentives for everybody to build their own thing. But for the long term, what you really want is high quality standards and implementations that have a diverse set of maintenance and contributions over time. So I would also ask, how many of your upstream open source dependencies are you supporting? If you're not supporting them, why not? So I think a lot of this is movement building, is what it comes down to. And movement building takes a long time. To the point of marketing, you can't just keep telling people, well, in the long term, it's the right thing to do. And that applies to open source software as well. What are some things that you can get immediately that are different, that enables different things? I hear a number of projects who talk about things that like banking the unbanked. I'm like, that's amazing. That's an amazing focus.
I was just making a comment. I wasn't going to interrupt you, but I was saying, let's do the opposite. Let's unbank the bank and not bank the unbanked. Let's just.
Oh, that's a great.
Let's do the opposite.
The banked.
Yes, exactly. That is what we need to do. Not bank the unbanked. Let's not give them banking. They don't need it. They need to unbank the unbanked. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Sorry.
No, not at all. It's fantastic. Let's at least get some fun clips out of this, right? So I'm like, that's amazing. Are you spending some time on the ground in Southeast Asia or Africa or parts of South America or other places like this? I think that's another thing that I'd like to see more of is, when I was getting started with open source, it was the early 2000s. And frankly, the vast majority of people participating in open source were young white males in North America and Western Europe, because also those were the areas of the world that were online with who had high-speed internet at the very beginning that was connected and so on. early 2000s. We're barely out of the dial-up times at that point. And so today, we really do have the whole world online. So we have a responsibility to get more people involved in different ways and then really address local problems, right? We have members on our team in Africa who don't have stable home internet. They actually use a mobile hotspot to connect, and that's fairly common. So can we use edge applications and IPFS to message and share data peer to peer? So those are the sorts of things that I'd want to be looking for. Yes, it's incredibly hard, but a lot of the Web3 space is developers sitting in front of a laptop or desktop with a large professional desktop operating system, building applications in full screen. If your stuff doesn't work on mobile and you only can use it with a browser extension, you're not building for the whole world.
I would go absolutely further here. You're saying build it in full screen. I would be lucky if some people test on certain, like Safari, even, they don't bother, people like, and I'm not an Apple user myself, but still, Jesus, at least Jesus got nothing to do with it, but test him as well. Definitely. But exactly, this is ridiculous. It's a lot of people when you start to talk to people more and more, and I have been myself down that road. I have been in Middle East. I have been living in the Middle East. I've been in Asia, living in Asia, in Africa, and you see those things. This is a different world. And when you're born today, a white male in Europe or on the States, you're a very lucky person, to be honest. You're like in the 5%, if not less. And people just really don't want to see beyond it. They forget the 80-20 parity, that the 80 and the people forget that it applies to everything, not just to finance. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think I can rant a lot on mobile. I was onboarding people and explaining what was happening with blockchains, and there's this interesting stuff that was happening. And I was onboarding people initially with Dogecoin. There's a good app on iOS, and I'd get people to download an Android or iOS wallet, and I'd get them to set up a wallet, and I'd send them some Dogecoin. And I onboarded tons of people in person. And then when I started working with Ethereum, I created my own Boris coin. And just as an example, same thing. And I would get people to download a wallet at the time, Trust Wallet, when it was an open source project before it got purchased by Binance. Really great mobile, open source on iOS and Android. And I'd get them right there to do that. And of course, a lot of people who are deep into crypto were like, I don't have a wallet on my phone. Again, this is how people primarily out in the world is they have a mobile phone as their one and only computing device. That is the majority of the planet. And so we have to practice these things. So again, what is the immediate utility? And in fact, there's some interesting surprise and delight that you can do when you start to understand the system, right? Like, again, you can do some of these things with a regular website or a database or so on. But it starts to click after a while where it's like, oh, you have this like QR code and you can scan something and I can pass you something back and forth. And how do you create Boris Coin? Why does it have your face on it? And I've been doing that. I've onboarded 300-400 people in person to encourage them to create a wallet on mobile. So I think those are the sorts of things. Again, okay, now that we're out in the real world with a public-private key pair on a secure operating system that is biometrically locked, that can back up encrypted to cloud services. Frankly, that's better than desktop with a browser extension. And I'm really excited. My friend Pedro building Wallet Connect that, of course, connects those phone wallets to browsers and lots of other things as well, right? We've come a long way. And what are we going to do with it?
I think that is actually the biggest question. But this is interesting that you say that, because the next question I have for you, I like to go on projects' websites. I like to think of myself as a little bit of a product person. And so one of the things I do is I go on project websites, and one of the first things what they say to, I'm looking, sorry, at some of the first things they say. And like you said, what are we going to do with it? And this is the question exactly. So the Fission website says building protocols for the future of the internet. What is the future? What future is the correct one? How do we know that it's correct? And where is that future?
Yeah, great question. So I think we're a bit of a funny company, and we are ultimately one of the core things that we do right now. We're a protocol engineering team. So I talked to you about building this edge app stack of identity data compute on top of IPFS. We really think that content addressing is huge. Unlike location-based addressing, right now, If you run a server at example.com, no one else can help you host example.com. Let's say an actual file, example.com/boris.jpg. No one else can help host that file. They could download it and they could put it on their own server, myserver.com/boris.jpg, but we don't know it's the same one. And in fact, it doesn't share between the two. And once you put content, whether it's an app or files or data or something that's encrypted onto content addressing, amazing. We do all sorts of different interesting caching. So if you have a podcast that I really like, I can help keep it online. I know that that podcast hasn't been edited because it has a unique content address, and I can save it literally even just on my desktop or on my phone. And then when people around me are requesting it, I'm helping keep it online. That's this really nice commons network of IPFS. However, in practically leaning in and trying to use IPFS for apps, for entire apps, and for read write of IPFS and adding that, we found that the IPFS protocol itself still needed work. So we ended up getting sucked in, and rather than just working on our dev tool stack, we kind of went on a multi-year journey of working with the extended IPFS and Filecoin ecosystems in improving the protocol itself. So that's kind of what we mean by that. And Brooklyn Zelenka, my co-founder and CTO, she developed UCAN, which is decentralized auth protocol that's getting some really good adoption. All of these things we end up developing as open standards. One of the downsides of IPFS was that everything was in public. So Brooke developed the web native file system, WinFS, which is a way for users, apps, and servers to have encrypted data on top of IPFS in a turnkey way. And so what is the future of the internet? I think part of it is having things more user centric, having portable data, having something that's content addressed. That means you could do everything from mobile to servers to embedded devices and everything else like that in a way that is a really interesting open way, including self-verifying data. And a lot of things need to be secured by cryptographic tokens and signing in different ways. So killing the password. I think also today that user data has become a toxic asset. If you are running a service that has lots of user data, you can get hacked. And if you don't keep it encrypted, it can get stolen. So I think it's important for more and more data to be end-to-end encrypted and encrypted at rest. I sometimes joke and I say that if Apple's iCloud and their system in general was open source, then Fission wouldn't have to build what it's building, right? That kind of mode where instead of everything going through separate servers, you've got your own devices at the edge, you've got local computation doing things like machine learning and other things like that, and things being fully encrypted. And so what we want to do is both build protocols, and that means standards. So it's not just us. It's not just a chunk of open source code. It's one level more important than open source code, which is the spec. So multiple people can implement it in multiple different programming languages and know that they have interoperable, and then use those building blocks to build these more user-centric, more secure, more privacy protecting applications and services. That's where we're heading.
I like this future, and hopefully it doesn't contain the word on-chain status, because I like that it's one of the biggest scams, right? Like on-chain, you're on-chain. What do you mean I'm on-chain? I'm already been on-chain all my life, and the computers are connected. It is. Sorry, I'm going on a different thing. I do want to talk a little about storage and about the IDs, but you mentioned the word interoperability, and of course, having such a name as Citizen Cosmos, I cannot help to ask: are you guys currently? I know you are because I've been on your GitHub, but let's make it public. Well, let's talk about it. I mean, are you guys at all building anything for the Cosmos ecosystem? Are you currently working just with Ethereum? Well, of course not, because you're also working with IPFS, which means you're kind of working with anything that wants to store anything, which means you are working with Cosmos. But I'll shut up and let you answer. Sorry.
So we're really focusing on a stack right at the edge, and it composes well with any blockchain. So we've done a proof of concept that we call wallet auth, where basically people can use existing blockchain wallets on any chain to use their existing keys as a DID And then we pair that with an encrypted WinFS file system on IPFS. We haven't done this yet for any Cosmos-based chains. Theoretically, parts of this should work with the EVM OS and other chains that include an EVM. This is a public call. All of our stuff is open source. We'd love to see some proof of concepts of doing that. We also work with the Chain Agnostic Standards Alliance, CASA. That's something I was involved with the very beginning with Pedro from Wallet Connect and Ligi from the Ethereum Foundation to not have to reinvent the wheel. We're having a discussion with Brave and their built-in wallet and the MetaMask team and others on standards for using wallets and the public-private keys there to the proper way to encrypt and decrypt data in a standardized way. So we're always working on those sorts of things. And then personally, just having come back from Lisbon, IPFS Camp, Protocol Labs Summit, Filecoin Lisbon, lots of things happening there. We think Filecoin is unique. So IPFS is awesome, works everywhere in many ways. Content addressing has won and continues to win in really interesting ways. It's a commons network. It's best effort. People say, that's terrible. What if it goes away? And I say the flip side, literally any piece of content that any human on the planet cares about, they can keep online themselves, effectively for free, effectively forever. That's a really good use case. Incentivized persistence, paying for persistence is also very important. And Filecoin being a chain that has focused on that is great. And the next challenge is interacting with lots of other systems of all kinds. So one of the things that we kicked off is a new working group. There's going to be a Filecoin interchain and bridge working group. I know where there were some early discussions already of Cosmos ecosystem as one of the first places to bridge into. And so that's really how I see this work. Happy to talk more about this. Come see us, come check out our code. And our stuff composes really, really nicely with any sort of chain.
I think I'm definitely gonna try and get the cyber team to look at what you do, and I suggest you guys look at them because they were, yes, I'm a bit biased, but they were the first Cosmos chain to work with IPFS 3 or 4 years ago already, and they use IPFS as basically the heart of the system.
Amazing.
That's all built on that. So yeah, I think you guys might have a lot of, and it's all completely open source. So maybe some libraries that you use, when I'll definitely do the same thing for them. Talking though about Filecoin and about storage, and this is actually, I mean, the IDs is another topic I would love to talk about, but for a second about Filecoin and storage. So there is like the devil's advocate thing, and there's like the good thing. The devil's advocate thing, which I would also love to hear your opinion, is that I would like to separate, I think, IPFS and Filecoin. Like, right? I think there's like IPFS, the cool thing, and there's Filecoin with a little bit of, well, I don't know. There's questions to be asked and there's questions to be answered. And this is actually a question to you, not to me. Do you think that if Filecoin would to go away tomorrow, including the foundation and the money the foundation has, would IPFS still be around, considering what it is?
Yeah, it's a commons network. It literally can't go away at this point. So a lot of people point at it as saying that, like, as a downside. Oh, well, how do you know it's going to stay online? It's like, well, how do you know a website is going to stay online? It's the same. Someone has to do work, possibly pay for resources to keep things online, keep things fast, and everything else like that. I think we're in a really tough spot in this Web2 ad-supported world where a lot of people in the world have been trained that everything on the internet is free. And there's two parts to this. One is, let's use a completely made up example. A JPEG on the internet. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't hurt anyone if you copy those bits. Amazing. Abundance. Creative Commons licensing, a bunch of other things like this that allows for reuse and mixing. It doesn't cost anything. That's amazing. That's a fantastic basis. We should have this abundance mindset around it. Same thing with open source code, right? The bits of code that you have checked in a GitHub repository, download it, make a copy. It doesn't hurt, it doesn't subtract from that. But at scale, this does cost a lot. And in fact, the interesting thing is that bandwidth. If you have some services at Amazon and you're using S3, and S3 was the first service that Amazon launched. I launched some Drupal hosting services in the early days in 2005. So this was about 18 months before Amazon launched S3 or any of the AWS services. So we had to run a lot of like bare metal or VPSs and do all that stuff ourselves. And it was a lot harder. But anyway, with Amazon S3, you pay, a relatively small amount for storage. And the cost for bandwidth is 5x that. I actually had someone approach me. They're like, "Oh, Fission, we're trying to check out IPFS, really interesting things. We're hosting some stuff on Vercel right now, but we got a bandwidth bill for $1,000 last month." I'm like, "Yeah, can IPFS make that cheaper?" I'm like, "Probably not." It depends on the use case and a bunch of other things like that, right? There's some really interesting deduplication use places for IPFS, but if you need to persistently keep something online, whether it's IPFS or a commercial hosting service like Vercel, you're still going to have to pay for bandwidth in some ways, and if you want it to be fast, you may need to do some caching, and that's either running stuff yourself or paying someone to run it. And this comes down to, I'll do the open source thing again, right? So the code is free. If you file an issue, there's only so many maintainers with only so much time. Being in the community, writing documentation, troubleshooting things, maintaining it, right? If you build something in JavaScript, approximately a week later, if you have any sort of normal dependencies, you'll need to update 5 different dependencies. And that's work that has to be done by someone. And so I think that's something to keep in mind generally, that protocols like IPFS are not going to go away. And they give us the capabilities to work on a commons network together. But people shouldn't be surprised if they start needing to think about how they help themselves, their users, their partners, their friends, their countries, their regions do stuff. That's the part that we need to start making 100% the part of Web3, not the lip service part, but saying a responsibility to work together with others to maintain the things that are important.
I think that people really underestimate how much, myself included, I think, to be honest, until a certain point in my life, how much of a big role communication is in everything, whether it's money, whether it's religion, whether it's software, whether it's anything, relationships, it's all communication. And when we have a middleman there, then we shouldn't be surprised that something doesn't go our way. There's a middleman there that has a subjective opinion, right? Whether it's God or whether it's somebody, administrator on a server, it's still a middleman. So
exactly this. And I wanted to bridge it a little to Filecoin, right? So we can say things like storage is effectively free, asterisks, right? We have terabytes on our local machines, we have terabytes on our phone and other things like that. But the people time for maintaining servers and services and code, that's not free. And then if you scale it up, if you say, I need to keep around petabytes of climate data. Okay, now we're talking petabyte. We need RAID arrays and we need servers and we need, someone has to do the work. And you know what? It's really important data. So we should probably make sure that we have at least one offsite backup that's somewhere else as well. That's work, right? We've had this long phrase where we've considered the cloud to be this thing over there that someone else takes care of. And you can do that. There's a bunch of people that will pay you services that you can pay for those things. So I see Filecoin. That let's make sure this is backed up in 3 locations. And there is a marketplace where multiple providers can say, I have a good data center and I'll properly back it up and all that stuff. Something like that at that layer needs to exist, which is why Fission chose to work with Filecoin. Basically, if Filecoin didn't exist, it's the exact sort of thing that we would work on building. And whether it's IPFS or Filecoin, I think that's the other thing is we looked at it. And of course, 1 or 2 years ago, I'd be on here shilling Fission Coin. And Fission Coin was going to solve storage. And a lot of the stuff doesn't work very well yet. So where are we in our journey? We're in our journey that we need to pick some solutions that are going to work, that are going to survive into the future. And we need to make them better. And we need to keep solving people's problems. And whether it's fiat dollars or tokens, we need to pay for services so that other people keep servers on and files online.
I guess this was my initial question, and I might have asked it a little bit wrong, but what I was trying to get at is exactly the reward. Is not whether if Filecoin will go, IPFS will disappear, but more as what if there will be no market that will reward that work? Will it still? I mean, of course, something else will be invented. That is the obvious answer, and this is how markets work and live. So I guess, the question you kind of already answered.
So yeah, you could persist IPFS in a number of different ways. One of those things is that you could Fission essentially has had a like extremely long extended beta where we persist things for people that have accounts on our system. And we run on a number of different services, including AWS. And there's people that you could pay a regular SaaS subscription to get persistence as well. So I think that's the important thing for protocols is that you can mix and match these things. I think it's really interesting and important to not just have once you have a open protocols and markets around things like storage for Filecoin, then you can have people who take a whole different set of approaches. Some people might build a commercial offering for enterprise, for self-driving cars. I think they do something, I think I was reading 4 terabytes of data per day in telemetry and sensor readings. And again, imagine building an offering just for that data. Yeah, there's a great business there. And if for that business, using Filecoin or some other decentralized storage is a good fit and works for them, and like just because it's decentralized isn't going to make it win.
It's another topic, I think, a huge hot topic for discussion. But decentralization and philosophy and blockchain are not the same thing, and people really need to get to that. While still we are on the topic of storage, one last question, I guess, on storage. I have seen several different solutions so far into storage, and whether it's storage or SIA or Bluezell or Zero Chain or IPFS or whatever. I'm trying to look for the right word, not to offend anyone here, but there is always something like economics in Filecoin, or like nothing is working in storage. There's always something out there that is. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with CKB Nervous Network, and I guess that is a very elegant solution that I've seen, but still, it's not exactly storage. It's just an interesting solution to what they're building, but it's an independent silo, I guess, in terms of what they're doing now. So the question is isn't this the most simple solution here? I mean, the question is what would be the most simple solution, but I'm gonna like try to give an example of what comes to my mind. As a simple is, instead of making decentralized computation machines, why not also make decentralized disks machines? Like, I mean, we're already running blockchains machines which make decentralized distributed computations. Why not distribute the storage as well? Why not, like, each machine is just a hard drive? Why not? It sounds simple, but so the question is, like, which way do you think we should go, or should we just stay right now with the commons network that we have, IPFS, and everybody should really chip in and develop that?
Why not both? So I think a bunch of people are going to, I will advocate and shill for content addressing. Content addressing is amazing. I'm going to keep saying this. It has a way for us to, any file in the universe has a hash, has a content address that's self-verifying, and it won't change. That's amazing. And as an attribute, it means you can do some really, really interesting caching and transmission in different ways. So that's the promise, basically, of some of these things. So some of this is the long, steady work of standards and interop, where all of the systems that you mentioned could expose their persisted content as the content address. And then all of a sudden, we can have a number of different, we can come together and know that the content address is unique. How we fetch it, whether we have permission to fetch it, whether because of the type of account we have, it might be faster or slower to fetch such a thing. All of those things can be layered on top in different ways. But we know that this content address is the address of that asset, that media, that content, whatever it is. And we can go to multiple different places and get it. We don't really have that today at that layer. So that's why I try and open people's minds, is that, oh yeah, this is possible. There's a way you can see if you can fetch that thing. And the answer might be, I don't have it. You need to find it somewhere else, or it's permissioned, or other things like that. So I think that ultimately that's one of those pieces that come together. And it's very important for me because even without export formats or anything else like that, for the user, if their data is not tightly coupled to a server address, a location address, if it instead is used as a content address, that already means that systems that understand content addressing, that data will just work with those systems. So again, that sidesteps the whole question of use chain X, use company Y, and be like, oh, do you speak content addressing?
I definitely agree, to be honest. It was just like a question to go further. I mean, start with saving snapshots in IPFS, blockchain snapshots, because I think that is one thing that is really missing. Another thing is every thought has a hash. Jesus, everything has a hash. Jesus has a hash, probably. And, again, I'm sorry to offend all the religious guys out there, but it's true. Every thought has a hash, and we can connect it all into the big brain and work together with it. Quick question on the IDs before we resume. I had an interesting podcast guest. We had a very fascinating conversation. It was about a year ago, I would assume. And they had a very certain approach to the IDs and into the way they deal with it. And one question that I would like to ask you that I asked them is, isn't the best kind of DID is just a private and a public key pair? And that kind of solves pretty much everything out there. Do we need anything beyond that?
These are some of the areas where we bridge to different standards orgs in different ways. So DIDs are a recommendation now from the W3C, which works on web standards. The stuff that Fission works on goes beyond the web at the network layer and other layers. So we look at and use standards when we can, when it makes sense, when it fits our requirements. So for example, the web crypto API is built into every browser, including mobile browsers. And that's what the web native stack, the SDK that developers can use from us today, uses by default out of the box. So there's a non-exportable private key in your browser, that web crypto API, but not in user space where it can be stolen, but non-exportable. So every browser has that. So mobile Safari or Brave on your desktop, all of these things have support the web crypto API. And so we use that to derive a DID from just that public-private key pair. So DID key. I think there's over 200 different DID types. A lot of people think about identity and authentication services and they say, if I could charge just a few cents for every identity in the world, I will make a lot of money. So there's a lot of motivation to do a number of different DIDs, and there's the XKCD comic with lots of different standards and so on. We find it useful to have a decentralized identifier. A decentralized identifier, not identity, right? Your browser is not you. And especially we have browsers on multiple saints. You have multiple identifiers, right? And that's not even talking about username or anything else like that. Blockchain space, unfortunately, has over-focused on I use the same goddamn public-private key pair for every single app. And then if it's compatible, I cross chains and use it again for every single app. Thus we've done a terrible job of advocating for the user here. And it's going to have to evolve beyond that, right? We have to have some privacy in there. So DID key is a good starting point. It's pretty bare and you don't really know what you're getting. So there's not many constraints on it. DID PKH is one that works across chains. And generally, you should be able to use any blockchain key type and derive an address that you can then use with DID PKH. I think there's some other useful ones. I don't have the whole list in front of me. There's some web-based stuff that have some trade-offs of ease of use versus possibly people hosting stuff for you and other stuff like that. But ultimately, reusable identifiers controlled by the user that they can take with them is how you should think about it. And some of the existing DID work has been around very large enterprisey systems. What Fission has worked on is running code and rough consensus. That's the phrase from the ITF of this should be something that should be drop-in simple that front-end developers can just use to create accounts for their users, a hackathon, right? If we don't get that right, if the first step is run a giant Java server in a corporate data center, you're not going to get adoption because it's going to be too hard. And we'll see where the rest of the 200 list of DID types end up.
So I guess the answer here is basically usability and privacy, right? This is why it's not the point. So we need usability and privacy. By the way, talking about a person who wanted to give a couple of cents to every identity, Sam comes to mind here. Maybe that's the way he's giving 8 billion back to the world. No, I'm talking about Sam from FTX, of course, but yeah. Bad joke. I know, bad joke. Boris, I still have a lot of questions to ask, but to resume, I'm gonna do a quick blitz that we do with every guest, podcasts and their blitzes and blitz blitzes. Can you plural the word blitz? God knows.
Sure.
Give me 3 projects outside of the top 20, preferably, so not Filecoin and Ethereum and Bitcoin, that you are interested in terms of what they do technologically these days, watching them and watching what they're building.
Yeah, I met the team at the Coin Network. They're doing some very interesting things in lots of people even running servers at home. So I think there's some interesting stuff that they are doing, koii.network. I'm literally just going to list you people that I met in Lisbon. The Function Land team, also thinking about some home storage in different ways. And then the last one is one that I'm really excited about that we're going to be doing some more support for, which is Capiloon. So Capiloon is taking the original Firefox OS. They had a mobile operating system. It's since been forked called KaiOS and is used heavily in India with tens, hundreds of millions of feature phones in India. And so Fabrice from Capiloon has in turn forked it, and he's building a mobile Firefox OS called Capiloon that includes DWeb built in, so things like IPFS out of the box.
Cool.
And I think hardware and open hardware and mobile app stores, that's a whole other battle to fight that you can't really fight head on. For a variety of reasons, including user safety. Those mobile operating systems are, in fact, quite safe and secure for the average user. But Capiloon is very exciting, and I think there's some really interesting things that might be coming in that direction.
A shame we didn't meet in Lisbon because I was also there, but we didn't cross paths there. Second question, give me 2 things on top of your mind right now that motivate you to do what it is you do. And I'm not talking about writing code, I'm talking about believing in all the values that you've been talking about over the past hour and building what it is you're building. The 2 daily things that motivate you in your daily life to do whatever it is you do.
So I started building an open source that was more around like the basics, getting content online with blogging and CMS platforms like Drupal and WordPress and others, and standards like RSS. I've been blogging for over 20 years, and RSS was an amazing entry into that, talking to people all over the world, again, which is commonplace today. But think of like a cozy group of pen pals around the world that you read 3 posts a day rather than 3 posts a second as we do today. And so that motivation was, it's important for everyone, for individuals to be able to put stuff online and communicate that way sort of directly. And what we've seen is ultimately a lot of those platforms are too complicated to run. There's security issues. The LAMP stack architecture means you're like running these entire servers. And we need to make it ever more simple so that people can communicate directly and share things that they care about and communicate about very important topics. And so in many ways, I'm back because mission wasn't completed the first time around. And I think it's important that we have easy ways for people to communicate, to collaborate, to work on things together. Sometimes that means facilities for pooling capital together. That other thing has been perhaps made easier by parts of Web3 and now the pause, to solve the really hard problems that we have ahead of us. So can we connect in our local community? Can we support and buy local? Can we then connect to other people who are on the other side of the world who are in their own local area, but maybe facing similar challenges? And can we share the knowledge and information that we have from code to apps to capital to anything else to build together? And can we demand more of our local, regional, and national governments to act in the same way? Here's a weird thing. In the US, lots of information, lots of data is required to be publicly available if it's paid for by government funds. In Canada, where I live, things that are produced by the government are usually by default covered under King's copyright. I'm like, but I literally fucking paid for this. It should be available to the country. So even some of these principles of design of decentralized systems, of open information, how do we bake these in a way, you're going to hear me say it again, that protects user privacy, that keeps people from harm, that means collectives of people can work on things and support each other in getting stuff done. If it doesn't fall into those categories,
I just want to say like one more in the Blitz, the question. But before I say that, one thing, as an islander, I definitely understand about what it means to connect local communities. And you're talking about just paid for this thing. Well, what surprises me more is that when you have your own land and then you have to get paid to get buried on a cemetery. But like, wait a second, I have my own land. I want to get buried here. I don't want to go to the cemetery. No, 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 no. That doesn't work like that. You need last question. One person, doesn't matter, developer, writer, philosopher, Bitcoiner, not crypto guy, Medium, GitHub account, Twitter, doesn't matter. A book, one person you suggest everybody else out there to follow or to read?
I'm going to say two.
Okay, two is good, two is better.
Firstly, everyone should read Ostrom. Eleanor Ostrom wrote about commons and how to sustain commons. And then the other one is Christine Lemmer-Weber. She is the architect of the ActivityPub spec. She's done amazing work around OCAP capabilities model for security. She's got a new nonprofit called the Sprightly Institute that is working on doing secure capabilities in a distributed way. And I'm really excited to see how her work powers a number of different things. So check out Christine Lemmer-Weber at Sprightly and read Ostrom.
Boris, thank you very, very much. Of course, the show notes will contain all that, and of course, all the links to Fission. So thank you very, very much for finding the time to join me. Everybody else, thank you too. Thank you for listening.
It's been awesome. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks. Bye.
This content was created by the Citizen Cosmos Validator. If you enjoyed it, please support us by delegating to Citizen Cosmos and help us to create more educational content.